Good morning. It's now 9:05 a.m. here in Sacramento. My name is Connie Galambos-Malloy. I'll be chairing this session of the California Citizens Redistricting Commission. Our first order of business is to run through the agenda. Been a couple minor changes since we adjourned yesterday evening. We'll be opening up the meeting with opportunity for public comment on items not on the agenda. We'll move into wrap-up items from our advisory committee report backs yesterday. We had some significant outstanding items from both the Finance and Administration Committee, focusing on the budget, and from the Outreach Committee. We'll have a public information presentation, report back from that committee, and an update from our communications director, Mr. Rob Wilcox. In the afternoon, we'll have a training on Bagley-Keene presented by our Chief Counsel, Mr. Kirk Miller. And towards the end of the day, we'll tie up some loose ends with our scheduling of future meetings and some updates on other trainings that will come in the future. We do plan to offer two opportunities today for public comment. The first will come immediately in the next 5 minutes, and the second we will do right after the lunch hour. With that, I would like to invite any members of the public who would like, we need to do roll. Let's do roll call. Let's do a voice call, please.
Commissioner Aguirre?
Here.
Commissioner Anchetta?
Here.
Commissioner Baraba?
Here.
Commissioner Blanco? Commissioner Dye?
Here.
Commissioner DiGiulio? Commissioner Filkins-Weber?
Here.
Commissioner Forbes? Commissioner Galambos-Malloy?
Here.
Commissioner Antai?
Aye.
Commissioner Parvenu?
Here.
Commissioner Raya?
Here.
Commissioner Ward?
Here.
Commissioner Yao?
Here.
There's a quorum present.
Thank you very much. At this time, I'd like to invite any members of the public who'd like to comment for items not on the agenda to please come forward.
Good morning, Commissioners. Yesterday afternoon, I gave you some ideas for straw man that you could use in doing your maps. I didn't give you, however, an assessment of, or my assessment of what I felt each of the four options might be of value to you. If you were to use the 201 maps as your starting point, I think that would probably be the worst possible case that you could pick because of the gerrymandering that happened that would have to be undone. If you were to start with a blank map of the state, that would require significant work on the part of the Commission in order to create the 113 districts that you need to create for 2011. The amount of work involved might be weeks or months of your effort. If you were to use the 1991 maps as your basis, there still would be a fair amount of work. And the key point there would be that the number of districts required for the congressional area has changed. It was 52, now it's 53. Therefore, every district would have to be adjusted. The easiest for you, in my opinion, would be to hire somebody to start and go through the state and create a new set by applying all of the rules that are in the Voters First Act and also Title V and Title II. That would give you a clean base to start with and something that you could then shoot your arrows at and apply all of the testimony that you're about to receive. Any questions? Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Our next member of the public.
Madam Chair, members, my name is Ted Toppin. I am a citizen and, in all honesty, a Sacramento lobbyist, but I am not here for any clients who have really no interest in redistricting. I am here to comment for myself, and it's before you start your agenda today, I want to urge you to revisit an action of yesterday, which I watched online, and that was the decision to remove the scoring table from the invitation for bid for the redistricting services. I mean, this commission has done well in its starting in its infancy here to pick the best people and the most impartial people. That was the filter used in selecting yourselves. That was the filter used in selecting yourselves, your staff. And I think you missed an opportunity to keep that standard in selecting your line drawer. It is not enough just to be able to draw the lines and abide by the the requirements to recognize diversity in communities of interest. What you want to do is be able to have a process that finds the very best person or persons or company to do this. And I think by moving to a pass and fail standard, you've sort of set yourself up for perhaps being painted into a corner for selecting not the best qualified person, but a person who meets the minimal standards, and with a low bid or a bid that is lower than the best qualified person, you will be left with not the best choice, not the most impartial choice, but a choice that perhaps will handcuff you in the future. So I would really like it if you would reconsider that and think about what your options are going forward. If you don't want to restore the scoring table, you certainly need to bolster the impartiality provisions that are part of the invitation for bid. So that is something I really think you should reconsider. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Toppin. Are there any other members of the public who'd like to comment on items not on the agenda? Seeing none, we'll transition into continuing our advisory committee report backs. We are going to start today with the Finance and Administration Committee, picking up where we left off with the... Pardon? As I mentioned when I ran through the agenda, we will be continuing. What I'd like to do today is pick up with the committees where we had outstanding business to finish up. So we will be moving into outreach a little bit later in the morning, but we are going to do budgeting first. We have some things we're trying to resolve regarding our technical capacity in this room. We would like to have a PowerPoint in place for one of our guests to do a presentation, so bear with us while we juggle the agenda in order to make that happen. With that, we'll do Finance and Administration.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You should all have in front of you a spanking new copy of the pro forma budget that was revised with input from the Finance and Administration Committee by Mr. Claypool. And he has, at a request, pulled out some assumptions on the right-hand side so that you can understand what was driving these numbers. I think we'll just take a second to let everyone look through this quickly.
Commissioner Dye?
Yes.
I'd also like to tell the public that might be watching that this has been posted or is being posted at redistricting.ca.org on our behalf.
Yeah.
Oh, redistrictingca.org on our behalf. Thank you.
Thank you. We're trying to get better at that.
Commissioner Moy,
Yes, Commissioner Barama.
I'd like. What's they have the columns here, and I don't know what they what the columns stand for.
Okay, let me explain each of the columns. The first column, they don't quite match up, so you might want to draw this over. The first column is the $500,000 that BSA requested for the selection of the commission. Of course, we know they spent a lot more than that, but that was what came out of the commission's budget. And then there's a little typo here, but the second column is, which is actually the first main column that you see, is the budget that runs through June 30th of 2010, which is fiscal year 2010-2011. And then there's a projection for beyond June 30th that goes through the next fiscal year through June 30th, 2012. And this is where I said we're actually going to have to make some decisions as a commission what we want to use for our forward budgeting in terms of what kind of skeleton staff we need moving forward. There's some initial assumptions here. There are probably some adjustments that need to be made based on some of the input from the outreach committee yesterday. And what I'd like to focus the discussion on are the assumptions, because this is a pro forma budget. We, don't know what some of these things will be. We've tried to make good, educated guesses and come up with a reasonable budget. Okay, so if everyone's had a chance to look through it, I'm just going to let Mr. Claypool kind of talk about each of these categories with discussion of the base assumptions.
Certainly. First of all, just a slight point of clarification in that this was created by me initially to go forth to the Department of Finance, and the Department of Finance requires that we go all the way across through the fiscal year 11-12, assuming that this commission would still be running. So that's why we spread it across. As Commissioner Dye said, the first column in 910 only has one number, and it's the $500,000 from the Bureau of State Audits, and that has actually been allocated to them out of the original $3 million budget that we had. And then the other, as we go over to fiscal year 10-11, we see just a transfer cost and then an $81,212 amount. That's the amount that's encumbered right now by our contracts with the Department of General Services. Those are pretty self-explanatory. I'm going to just move down into the operating expense and equipment. Yesterday I told you that our rent is paid by the governor, and that is true. But you're going to look into 11-12, and you're going to see $80,000 there. And the reason I put that there is because we might get to August 15th and then have a discussion as to whether or not that constitutes the end of the need to support you, or whether or not that support was intended for the entire life of the commission while you maintained offices. I don't know the answer to that, so I put $80,000 to cover a $10,000 a month expense from August through the end of the fiscal year 11-12. We dropped down to phone lines and data. The estimates were $1,500 a month through August, dropping down to $500 through September through June. Again, spreading it across, assuming that this commission would keep some presence. Same with office supplies. These are just absolute estimates based on what I would think would be rational consumption. We haven't actually had the opportunity to have that kind of consumption. So these are soft numbers, but it was the best I could come up with. Salaries. As you see going down there, this assumes that you would maintain an executive director, a chief counsel, and at least one program analyst through the entire fiscal year. After that, you also see the estimate at the times that I would think that you could think about starting to drop staff off. All of this assumes a 1.4 multiplier for the benefits package that normally go with your staff. And the only thing that might be a little unusual there are the leave balances that were carried forward from the executive director and the chief counsel. And we came over with leave balances. So when your staff comes over, typically in the state, you just pick up those leave balances and you pick up the expense for them. But it was something that needed to be expensed in your budget. Any questions about the staff salary costs?
What's the head count from average head count past August 15?
Oh, your total number of staff?
Yes.
It would be 7, because as you see, I've included the budget officer in that, and the budget officer figure for this fiscal year is reduced to start at the beginning of this month coming up. So it's 7 through August 15, and after that, it assumes that you would maintain the first person that would drop off would be at the end of October. This has been the ongoing discussion. There are many things that your staff are going to have to wrap up and do, particularly archiving of all the different documents that we have here, putting together another budget for you. We'll maintain some. We'll maintain some communications, and so your communications director will have to do some work for you towards the end. And this also assumes a transition in the unlikely event that someone would litigate, because I believe this commission is going to do such a good job that we're not going to have to worry about that. So,
Commissioner Yao, did you have further comments? I have a question.
So, as a big picture, we're going to maintain full staff until end of 2011. And then we'll start seeing drop-offs starting in January 2012. Is that approximately what it is?
January 12, if we follow this budget, January 12, January 1st, you'll go to 3 staff.
Okay.
Yeah, and actually the drop-off starts in October.
Mm-hmm. With the commission assistant.
Right. But the significant drop-off is going to be at the beginning of next year.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and this is, I mean, obviously this is something that if we determine we don't need people past, August 15th, we can revisit that. I think this is, right now, we're trying to put a budget that, allows us some flexibility here.
Commissioner Anchetta.
So, again, there are probably going to be, outside of this budget, litigation-related expenses, which I assume will be handled probably by the Attorney General's office or if there's outside counsel. I think Mr. Miller has alluded a couple times previously to Public Records Act requests that might come in. And again, given the nature of that law, I think they can come in anytime, right? I'm wondering how, given that that's a possibility, it may be much higher, certainly, in 2011 and maybe early 2012, but if there is an ongoing need to comply with that law, what's the best way to sort of build that in? Again, given that we don't really, it's very hard to predict, obviously, but they could be fairly intensive in trying to get all those documents together. I'm not sure if that gets put someplace else in terms of other state agencies, or it still needs to be with the commission. But I suspect something needs to be allocated someplace for that kind of capacity.
Thank you for raising that issue, which indeed is an important one for the commission to consider. My sense of it is that we don't necessarily need a special allocation for that, but it is a challenge. This is an example of where working with a very small staff creates a challenge, because those can be very time-consuming to respond to. I think the short answer to your question would be this is an example why the Commission should retain some flexibility in the staff numbers beyond August 15th, because that is an example of a unknown but probable piece of work that would continue after that date. Is that responsive to your question?
Yes, in general, but I guess I'm wondering if to the extent we can try to anticipate that, it might be good to put a line item in if it's not already sort of absorbed in the positions. But I'm just curious about whether that.
Yeah, any litigation-related expense would be a separate item.
But again, I'm concerned about the Public Records Act specifically.
If I may interrupt you, to note for the record that Commissioners DiGiulio, Belanco, and Forbes have now joined us. Continue, Mr. Claypool.
So this does actually address this, and this was one of the, and so I'm talking in state language, and so I'm going to move back when I say this assumes that you maintain a staff that archives these records after August 15th in a form that a 3-person staff can access and move forward. That's why we're keeping people through the end of the year, because there's a lot of work with the state archives, and there'll be a lot of work with our own internal archives to ensure that when someone makes a request, we can produce those documents within the required amount of time. So it's built in, but it's built in by just maintaining the staff, and that's the work that they would be doing.
Mr. Claypool, I actually have a question. To what extent were your estimates around staffing costs informed by research as to how other redistricting commissions have functioned in other states. And the reason that I ask that is I'm interested in what different scenarios might look like depending on the level of activity our commission anticipated taking. We haven't really discussed it in a lot of detail as a commission, but following our creation of the maps, given on what a tight timeline we're working, there may be other pieces of work that are needed. There may be, pieces of legislation that need to be passed. There may be constitutional changes that need to happen in order to make sure that the next commission is able to operate more effectively. So whether we would plan to do that all ourselves or have some different staffing, I'd really be interested in hearing more about other models of how that looks in other states.
Well, first, no other state has ever done this, so there is no model for our state. If you looked at Arizona, and again in my conversation with their executive director, they pretty much just, when it was over, they put everything into archive, but they were supported by a specific group within state government that handles small commissions. So they had this, and then they brought on outside counsel to do the litigation, or kept them. So, insofar as a model for keeping the staff, that is, I don't think that we have a good one anywhere.
Yeah.
If you look at some of the other states, I believe Iowa actually keeps a small commission staff around because they do. In my recollection, and my recollection can often be faulty, but my recollection is that they kept a small staff because they had different types of data that they collected for their legislature, and so this was part and parcel to my conversation yesterday and what Commissioner Dye alluded to. You as a commission are going to have to decide what type of staff, what type of things you plan on putting into place. If there are going to be legislative changes, you're going to probably have to maintain a staff far beyond 2012. If there is litigation, then you will need to maintain a staff until that litigation is over, because in my mind, the very worst thing you can do is let your staff disappear, because once they disappear, they're very hard to get back. So,
thank you. Commissioner Ontai and then Commissioner Yao.
Well, one issue that may come up that we might have to convene as a commission in 2012 is the undercount analysis and how that would impact our previous decision on map making. I think that might be something that we might have to look at seriously.
Commissioner Yao.
We have other state organizations supporting us prior to being fully independent. For the purpose of the budgeting, maybe we can put on record saying that beyond fiscal year 2011-2012, this be folded back into the Secretary of State, who is responsible for the election issues. And again, this is strictly for the budgeting purpose, so that and run with it on that basis, unless we want to take time out at this point in time to address those type of issue in our schedule at this point.
I don't believe that's an option. I mean, the Secretary of State's support was purely for transition for us as an independent state agency. So I don't actually think that's an option for us. I believe that we as a commission will have to make some decisions, and I don't think we can make them now. I think we need to see how this goes. What we're trying to do is put a budget that reflects some reasonable assumptions, which we may change our minds, For example, Commissioner Ontai brings up a good point, but as we heard in our presentation yesterday from Mr. Johnson, the census may decide not to release anything on an undercount. We may decide to make a request. California has done that in the past. We'll have to decide, moving forward beyond litigation, do we want to meet once a year? We have a 10-year appointment. And do we require much beyond a very skeleton staff, beyond the first couple of years? I don't personally think we can make those decisions now. What we're trying to do is comply with the Department of Finance's requests to project forward through the next fiscal year with a set of reasonable operating assumptions.
So a process suggestion here, as we're moving forward, definitely want to entertain this conversation, but this does seem like something that the Finance and Administration Committee could do some lead thinking on with input from other commissioners to come back to the full commission next time we meet with some different ideas of roles, post August 15th, what type of a commission do we want to be and what would it take to actually carry that off. I have in the stack Aguirre. Was DeJulio as well? Okay, Commissioner Aguirre.
Just an observation that even though the Department of Finance is looking for us to project our activity budget through 2012, fiscal year 2011-12, afterwards, I think that our understanding of redistricting is going to evolve, and there are challenges that we're going to be presented with, and certainly there's going to be some questions that come up regarding whether this model really, how well it has worked, so that as we go through that process, we're going to, I think, evolve a concept of what we might be able to do as a commission, or what we should do as a commission, to pave the way for the next commission that comes along. In briefly, an evaluation of the process, a continuing role perhaps for this commission into the next few years, and if that happens, it might not, but if it happens, we can go to the legislature to look for an allocation that would carry us into the future beyond 11-12. Is that correct?
That is correct. And also, I want to also confirm what Commissioner Dye had said. The Bureau of State Audit's function and the Secretary of State's function were strictly startup. On the next round through, the only reason that the Secretary of State would become involved would be if this commission decided to fully dissolve their staff offices and so forth and have no representation, in which case, in 2019, whoever your executive director would be at that time would start this process all over again of reconstituting an office, which is some argument for maintaining a small presence, just so that you have some continuity and you don't have to go through the pains that we went through on this one.
Do any other commissioners have questions on this? Commissioner Filkins-Weber.
Chair, you had mentioned that you were looking for further input from other committees. As I understand it, does the Department of Finance require this right now for consideration of a budget officer? Or
no. When I said the Department of Finance requires it, just in the format that I budget across that I show them 3 fiscal years, and so this is just the format that allows me to write the letters for the release of our funds. It's a formatting issue, strictly.
Okay, thank you.
So clearly, I'm observing that we have some longer-term issues to grapple with beyond this budget. What I would like to have us focus on now, do we have any immediate questions or concerns regarding this specific proposal for the fiscal years 2010-11 and 11-12?
I'd actually like to let Mr. Claypool kind of go into the next section now, unless there are further questions about staffing, actual permanent staffing.
Okay.
Excellent. Continue. Oh, I'm sorry, Commissioner Anchetta.
Sorry, I was just asking Commissioner Aguirre about the potential for an evaluation consultant, which again may, in the scheme of things, rank lower than other things we need to put in here, but it may be useful to put that kind of line item in because in the 11-12 fiscal year, we might, and I'm not tossing any figure out at this point, but it may be useful to have a formal consultant that can run through in terms of various levels of analysis, including organizational analysis, staffing, various things that, in the immediate aftermath, so to speak, of the work of the commission and its staff and the consultants, that would be good to get all this together and then sort of present to the commission at some point a report.
We have a line item for consultants, so let's let Mr. Claypool go into the next section, which is temporary retired annuitants.
Right, and per Commissioner Yao's suggestion yesterday, I have put the contracts with the persons so that you can see kind of how the logic of this evolved for these individuals. Because we had an immediate need for them, you'll see that the specialist one is is Carol Umfleet, and her staff service manager 2 position. And what we did was we used the temporary contract to immediately secure her services. I'm hoping that today this commission will allow us to consider her for 2 months, as with the rest of these. Actually, we'll allow these 4 positions for the time period shown so that we can bring them aboard to do the specific tasks that we need them to do. But the first one is the 2 months at full time, and then it's below it is the $5,000 for the temporary contract that secured those services. If you see the description, it says 2 months minus the $5,000 contract. Essentially, the $5,000 contract is picking up a portion of that salary, and so once we get them on board and the salary picks up, we'll have some portion of the $5,000 that we didn't use. But this is a cost that's just unavoidable if we use this mechanism. It's the same iteration down. The 2 other individuals, Mr. Washington and Mr. Rich, will both be at the Associate Government Program and Analyst full-time for 2 months. And then you see the legal retired annuitants position showing staff counsel at 4 and RA at halftime for 6 months. And then again, the minus $5,000 on the first fiscal year, on the fiscal year 10-11.
And again, this is a decision the Commission will have to vote on. Mr. Claypool used his authority to hire them on a temporary basis, and if we're willing to approve them on, again, a 2-month full-time salary basis, then they'll switch over.
I would like to say that again, one of the things that this commission will have to consider doing for their next commission is to try to give us delegated authority, which would eliminate this type of process in the future. Any other questions?
Okay, let's move on.
We're moving down to commission per diem. What I did here was I increased the number of days that the commissioners, on our conversation with Commissioner Yao about the difference, how some of the commissioners had traveled and so forth prior to me constructing this, prior to me even being me here. And so this assumes those days. It actually assumes about 14 days times 4, so it gives us an extra 56 days worth of traveling that may or may not have occurred or may occur in the future. But it was just to recognize on the business meetings that there have been meetings that you've attended that I've been unaware of for media and so forth, and so that picks up that part of it, that part of the budget. The next one down is communications media travel that we discussed yesterday. Our communications director has indicated that there would be 13 events, and it assumes 1 commissioner per event. And these are for going out and doing the things that Rob's going to do to promote.
Yeah, I just want to say there's actually 30 events. I think it's 13 different regions. I had it down there.
Oh.
So it's 13 different regions.
Okay. This will have to increase. Yeah, we'll have to basically increase. I read it as 13 events, and that was my error. But it should be. I can do that. But that essentially, if you triple that number, that's going to be approximately what the number is, and I can do that during the break.
Mr. Claypool, we have
Right.
Commissioner Ward.
Oh, thank you, Chair.
Yes, sir.
I was just curious, being on the communications subcommittee as well, I thought we had determined that there'd be 2 commissioners at a minimum at all of these media events per past discussion.
Yeah, there's 2 commissioners to some. There are some, like in Northern California and some of the smaller newspapers where there will be 1 commissioner, but for most of the events, there will be 2 commissioners.
I just wanted to make sure the budget reflects that.
Okay.
Mr. Claypool, additional question. We had spoken in the Finance and Administration Committee regarding the business meetings, and not just being the business meeting, but the prep for the meeting. Did you factor in a multiplier to account for that?
Right, and that's why I moved it out to 40. It assumes 56 extra days, for the prep on that.
Okay, thank you.
So clearly, the 30 events is going to that number is going to run up slightly, and I can give you a revised figure on that. It'll take me just a few minutes after we finish.
Mm-hmm.
Next line item is the educational outreach. Again, I know that there is concern as to how many individuals will actually attend. I'm budgeting for 3 of you at each of the 9 events, knowing that may or may not occur, but that was the number that I had actually heard spoken as an official number, and so it just in my mind, makes sense to just know that the money's there if that's how you choose to go. And then the same argument with the public input meetings. Will we have 14 commissioners at 30 events? Possibly not, but we have to assume that you will all attend all 30 events.
Sir, could I ask a question before we move on? Would that be all right?
Commissioner DiGiulio.
I'm just going back to what Commissioner Galamos-Malloy had raised about factoring in the extra hours of prep and whatnot that we talked about. And according to what Mr. Claypool said, it sounds like you had about 56 extra days. Is that correct?
Yes.
If with 14 people, that's only 4 extra days each. And I don't know about the rest of the commissioners, but I know even early on when we were reading resumes and whatnot, there was a day or so per section of a meeting.
To add on to what Commissioner DiGiulio is saying, also from the experiences of those of us who have served in the chair capacity, the level of prep time is significantly more than that.
So if we're only allocated 4 extra days each, I think that's way underestimating, just based on some of my experience.
Okay.
Commissioner Yao.
The other factor that did not take place is assuming a full commission at all the meetings. So I think it's difficult to be real precise about it, but
I think there's some cushion with the other budget that we could probably maybe absorb. But I do think, as a technical advisory liaison, I've been putting in an extra, at least a day per meeting, and I would imagine with anyone who takes on responsibility that going through our burn rate, 4 would really put us at a disadvantage.
Yeah, I had asked, I had guessed that the multiplier would be 50% extra days just in prep time, so I'm not sure if we come up with that. Because if you include the fact that, half the commission has to travel each time, that's a day of travel on either side.
So that I'm very clear on this, so we're talking about the prep time without travel, the time that you're consuming when you're working with these documents at home and so forth and getting ready for this. I can work this back and come back to you with a 50% multiplier, which I think probably makes some sense. Again, it makes more sense to have the cushion and know that it's there if you're absorbing the costs. And so I will work with that, and I will change that number as well. But it won't affect, as I understand it, the travel budget.
No.
Okay. So we move on to the next page, and we have the actual travel budget. And again, I'm going to have to rework the media budget because that moves from 13 to 30.
Yes, and Mr. Claypool, I think if you and I just spend 2 minutes together on that later, I think there might just be some confusion in what I gave you.
And then and assumes possibly 2 commissioners per event. So I'll work on those numbers. So the second number is needs to change. We'll move up. The first number again assumes that extra cushion that I put in for travel, knowing that some of you actually traveled on events that were business related, but not necessarily to a business meeting. The educational outreach, again, assumes 3 per meeting, 9 meetings, and the public input will always assume 14 commissioners at all meetings. Now, with the travel and also with the, and I think Commissioner DiGiulio alluded to this, with the actual per diems, this figure is going to give you some cushion on that other number, but it won't give us 0.5 cushion, so I'll rework that. Staff travel basically assumes 4 per for 13 days. It's on the business meetings. The reason I put 13 days, we had already consumed 4 of them in Claremont. I don't know whether or not we're going to go to other venues. It certainly was initially the intention of this commission to go to more than Sacramento. At this point, however, as we're moving into the input meetings, the outreach meetings, and so forth, it may be more practical to be able to avail ourselves of the Capitol and these types of settings. And so these 13 days, the additional 9 may never be used, but I put it in there in case one of you does come up with a great venue that, like Claremont, where they're willing to pay for everything, and in which case we would be willing to travel there, and that's why that's there.
Well, and I think the other thing that the Commission should consider is, as we find venues for these public input meetings, and just given the schedule, it might actually make sense for us to, if it's an appropriate venue for public input, it may also be an appropriate venue for us to have a couple days of business meetings before then. So.
The communications director, this is media travel, and this assumes that our communications director will be traveling down on these 30 events, periodically. And he had given me a 2-day travel with days of lodging, which I increased to a 7-day travel with lodging, just thinking that we need to have the flexibility for him to be able to fly back and forth to places if that's necessary. Okay, the educational outreach, 2 commissioners per 9 meetings, and I didn't need to make a note on that. That's self-explanatory. And the public input meetings are 3 staff per the 20 and the 30 meetings. Will you need 3 staff at your public input meetings? I don't know, but I can't tell you that you won't. If all 14 of you go to all of them, it takes 3 staff to maintain you. So, but if there's less than that, then there will be less than that number would be an outside number. The business meeting expenses. I took CCP's venue estimates to generate these numbers. The stenography assumes a 7-day turnaround, as we had agreed to, but that could increase because if we had agreed that if there was a necessity, we would go back to a 24-hour turnaround. The security staffing photocopies, I just assumed that their number was a good number to work with. So that's I don't know what security will be. I don't know what staffing needs will be at different places. I just needed to have a number, and they had the estimate. So at this point, I should pause and ask, before we get into the communications budget, whether anyone has any questions about things I've asked so far.
Yes, all the business meeting expense are triggered by the number of events.
Right.
And I think as we adjust the number of events, hopefully by the end of today, you probably need to modify it accordingly. So.
Okay.
Because the stenographers, I guess the education and public outreach, we're going to decide on that pretty soon, and I think we already made a decision on the stenography and the video graphic. I think we previously have made a decision on that. So all those are driven by the number of events, and so I think as soon as we pin that down, it's pretty much a straightforward calculation.
Just a point of clarification on that. I think we did set into place at our last meeting in Claremont the framework that we're approaching the meetings from. So while the exact dates might change, we agreed on the 9-region methodology, 3 phases. So the actual number of meetings is unlikely to change, or if it does, it would be very minimal, because we have agreed again on this framework.
Before we get off the commission expenses and so on, a reality check is to ask yourself how many days a month that you can spend on the redistricting business, okay? If I listen to the conversation, we're adding more and more per diem days to it, but pretty soon you're going to be working at 2 full-time jobs, and you got to really take into consideration question as to whether that's going to happen, because I suspect that we'll probably be addressing the high priority items and start letting go some of the lower priority items, simply because we can't devote enough hours to the redistricting event. So, case in point is in the month of January, we spend on average about 11 days per commissioners. And even though we will have all the outreach activity, are you still going to add all those outreach activity on top of the, let's say, average of 8 or 10 or 11 days that we devote to the normal amount of business? If you do, then now you're getting upward of 75-80% of a full-time job, and we may plan it that way, but it's, from my perspective, it's unlikely that all of us can have the option of doing that. So,
I think it's always been anticipated that there will be a range of our capacity to engage, and so even throughout the months, there may be some months that some of us are working full-time and others that are less so. But I would like to remind us that as we all applied to be on this commission, we knew January was going to be the lightest month of the year. We were advised that we might want to consider taking a leave of absence from our jobs. That was information publicly available on our website. So I think we're all having that conversation on our heads as the reality is coming onto our calendars now. But that's a point well taken.
Yeah, what I'm addressing is not how much time we're going to put in, but in terms of putting together a budgeting number, because the assumption that we're making is the full commission will be there at all the input meetings. I suspect reality will show that we're not going to do it, even though that's what we like to accomplish.
Commissioner DiGiulio, were you in the stack?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just making a comment that I assume, does that assume we're actually sleeping? Because some of us actually aren't sleeping. Some of those picked up.
Yeah, and by the way, I'm sorry.
No.
My 50% comment was actually based on 11, 12 days per month. If you consider January, we met 8 days. So if you add 50%, that comes out to 12. So that was where I got that from. So,
Commissioner Ward.
Thank you, Chair. And just for the remainder of the commission that didn't have the opportunity to be in the subcommittee meeting where this was discussed, it definitely was apparent that there are different ways to look at the I guess philosophy of this budget, and as we kind of hash that out, I think the consensus that we came out with generally was that we need to plan for what we think we need, reasonably need. We need to go through this and make sure that, there's not a personal jet for CRC or, for RE transportation, but things that we reasonably know that we might need to get the job done, and then we ask for it. And what we get might be very, very different than what we believe we need, and we'll make adjustments at that time. But going into this budget, already restricting what we reasonably expect we're going to need might be a mistake. So looking at this document as this is our best guess at what we need to get the job done for what we see being the business of the Commission. And that's our starting point and what we want to do with this.
I think Commissioner Ward's exactly right. We are trying to put together a reasonable, defensible budget that will allow us to get the budget augmentation we think we need.
And so Now we're going to move into the communications budget. And I want to note that I'm going to, if anyone has any questions other than the final one, the other media services as identified, which is the largest number there, Rob will handle, will take those questions, and then I will explain the number on the last one. So if anyone has any questions about just the first 8 items, I believe it's 8, 7 items.
Most of the communications budget is Rob's effort, so.
Is the website hosting the cost of the website, or is it the upkeep and all? Is that
It's actually the hosting. It's the payment to
It's the
the
payment
provider.
to the ISP provider. It's not the upkeep.
Correct. That would be handled under IT services.
Okay.
The question I have is the language and translation services. Is that well understood at this point?
I'm sorry, could you say that again, Commissioner?
The communication budget on language and translation services, is
Yes.
The assumptions and everything is understood?
Well, that number is in there.
In other words, have we made a decision to do a certain level of translation on meetings and medias and these things?
That as far as meetings, that wouldn't come under this budget if you're talking about outreach meetings and translation for this. We're talking about translation of materials or
Good.
translation.
Where would the budget be if one is necessary for translation of meetings?
Yeah, that's below in contracts, and we have a contingency for it. So I'd like to explain the last the last item, other media services identified. Rob, we need a contingency for unexpected opportunities, and there are a lot of unexpected opportunities out there. Rob had originally had a much lower number for the fiscal year 10-11, and we had talked about this. Yesterday, we had a very good conversation with a former choral fellow who came to us and is watching all of our events. Very, very bright individual, Ronnie Wood. She spoke to you. She gave us some good suggestions. She mentioned the possibility of working with some groups in Los Angeles in their native language and possibly producing some YouTube and YouTube spots and producing them so that people could spread them around. I believe the term, I must be getting old, my daughter said, Dad, that's going viral. I said, I thought that was when I got a cold. But I don't think we can ignore the possibility of some very good communication, something that could really promote this this commission. She called down and made some estimates and got an estimate for about $35,000 for 10 10-minute spots in 6 different languages and then 2 trailers. Do I think that we're going to absolutely go down there and spend this money for that? I don't know. But what I do know is that I've asked Rob to look into it, see how professionally run it is, see what they can offer, and just to put this money into this budget. I don't know that we won't have, if we don't use it for this, I don't know that there won't be another opportunity somewhere else for something like this. But what I do know is that we're starting to identify more and more individuals who want to produce, either give us some things for free, and Rob has some excellent videos. I believe you had mentioned Greenlining has just an excellent one, and certainly our preference is for free. But on the other hand, if we can work with some of the alliance groups that are down in Los Angeles to produce something in the language by the people who are living there, I think that it's an idea that has merit, and that's why I put this in here. If you want to, if you want to strip it out, we can back to the original amount. But I would like to leave it here for that reason.
Yeah, I was actually going to say it might be low. Some of the, I've been involved in a lot of organizations that do very effective short, media trailers and then put them on YouTube or have them go through Facebook or whatever. The production, even if you can get the labor for free, we've talked about using film students, for example, the production costs can be high, especially if you want to do a couple of them. So I personally think, we've talked about the importance in the Public Information Committee about youth engagement, that this is a very important segment of voters and potential voters we really want to engage in this process, and I think it would be worth that kind of investment and just put it as, web campaigns, production services.
I'm also supportive of this budget item. I think that the way tomorrow's event is structured, it will help us to identify what communities are already being well served by some of the groups and maybe where some of the gaps are that we'd want to focus our resources so that we ensure we're using it in a way that it's not simply redundant with what others are doing, but where we're really kind of going beyond and pulling other communities in who might not already be served in this process.
Can I chime in on that? I I totally agree with that also. So as a budgetary item, Commissioner Dye, would you like to recommend increasing it?
I'd like to double it.
Double it, good. I'll support that.
Commissioner DiGiulio.
Not to be too redundant, but I do agree with this as well, and I think something that the Commission can consider is the amount of utilization we would get with this relatively small investment. I think once these are established, the ability to reach into far places within the state would really justify the cost for this in terms of ultimately the upfront input would pay off in the long term for us.
Thank you. Commissioner Aguirre.
Yeah, and also if we're talking about developing a national model for citizens commissions, we can't afford to use yesterday's technology. We should be looking at future technology, and certainly this is what's available in the present is going to open the door for us. So not all of us are savvy in this technology, so it would behoove us to jump in ourselves. But ultimately, it's about developing a model, I think, that can be used across the United States.
Commissioner Blanc.
I have a question and a comment. Excuse me, I'm getting cold. So this is for public education about what redistricting is, or does it also include in regions where we are, we know we have some very remote regions, and we've been told and we've all agreed that we need to figure out innovative ways to reach them, not just to let them know about redistricting and how it works, but potentially input meetings that could be handled somehow remotely. So is this, in other words, is this just, here's what the work of the commission is, this is what redistricting is, this is how you can participate, this is how our criteria, and or we also including here communication, how people might be able to communicate with us through these other formats, even as we get to the input process.
So when Rob and I started talking about this, the thought was that we were looking for a way to get over the translation barrier, that we wanted to make sure that our message was getting out in as many languages as possible, and that if we could have this link that to this site, that it could be that vehicle that says, this is what we're all about, this is what we're doing, this is how you can be involved. But what I would say is, certainly with an expansion of the idea, it's yes to everything you said. As I'm learning about this world, it can be anything we wish it to be. Now, we have a line item for CCP to develop actually the webcast that we would direct people to that says, this is what our meetings look like, this is what we're handing out. Basically, our meeting our meeting in a webcast, and that remains very important to us as a separate line item, because if we don't get our funding, it becomes a main vehicle for doing our outreach rather than doing the actual meetings. So this, though, is all of the things you said, or can be.
Commissioner Parvenu?
This looks outstanding. We're covering a lot of ground here with the communications budget specifically, and I guess my question is, to what extent does this budget address the traditional forms of print outreach for those who are not computer savvy or not even on the internet? Where would traditional, like, local newspaper advertising fall in here? Like other media services or media community outreach? I'm assuming that includes those areas, but I know that, it's very costly to place ads, so please fill me in on this.
Yes. In very early on, when the Public Information Committee met and when I put forth a plan, it was to avail ourselves of as much free media as possible, because we knew we would never make a dent when you look at what a statewide campaign, a media campaign, paid media campaign, would cost millions of dollars. So what we're doing, and when I'll present my report a little bit later today, in that we are making use of radio, television, newspaper, web-based included, but all together in availing ourselves of a very robust program that commissioners will be involved in and reaching out across the state, but using it in a free basis and not a paid basis.
So my question is, this amount, more, or what do we want? And that answered my question.
For both lines. For both lines.
Yes, sir. Okay. The next, I should assume that we're finished with the communications budget. Any other questions? The next line is contractual or staff services. We don't know how we're going to actually acquire these technical analysts. And in speaking with Commissioners Blanco and Ancheta, we thought that perhaps some of these people could actually be hired on to staff if it were a less expensive way to go. We might be able to get them through the RA, which is even a far less expensive way to go, or we may just have to go out to them and just pay whatever their rate is for the level of expertise that they might have. So, again, we're looking at all of these contracts or these expenses occurring, or I put them in 1112. I'm wondering if probably we should have some of that expense in. So
yeah, I think we should spread it.
Split it in half. Okay. So the total amount is 200, and I'd like everybody to just think about that. These are, as we had originally started talking about, using procurement contract for them, $4.99 or less, and realized from Commissioner Blanco that many of these people aren't going to work for $4,999 or less in the things that we might ask them to do. If we look at where we're going forward, you had just discussed possibly having someone come in and give us kind of a wrap-up of how we did, kind of I think now I will tell you now that there will be no shortage of people who are going to be able to tell you that when this is over. And I know that the University of Berkeley right now has been doing an ongoing study, and because I actually participated with it, part of it at the Bureau of State Audits when we did kind of a post-mortem with them and talked about those types of issues. So there will be many papers and many things written about this, but if you intend to have someone come in and do it for yourself, we may wish to add some cost here and add that line here so that you know that you have that funding available to do that function.
And again, just for the Commission's clarification, this is these are additional anticipated expenses for social scientists, political scientists, statisticians. A lot of this is expertise we anticipate we'll need to properly address the Section 2 and Section 5 counties to ensure compliance with the Voting Rights Act, because a lot of that information is just not available through the census.
I do have a question, and it's just for my edification maybe, but what is a demographer, and is it a statistician? What is a demographer?
Is this the line item?
Well, you probably want to ask a demographer that's to define it, but I think generally social scientists probably would include a demographer. We wanted to come up with some general terms. Even statistician might cover various disciplines, but I think we're trying to capture a certain level of technical expertise, again, particularly around the Voting Rights Act, but there are related areas where, and this is something, might be for consideration in terms of that in-process review. There might be, I guess we have somebody in-house. It may have to be broken out separately as well, but it's really having in-house expertise, particularly for the Voting Rights Act analysis, because there's a lot of statistical analysis that will need to be either reviewed because there's being submitted to us, or we may have to, depending on what we want to do, have some of that analysis performed ourselves.
Well, the speaker we had yesterday, Hans Johnson, he called himself a demographer.
Right.
So, just for clarification, should we just insert that word in there?
You can. I think typically a demographer is someone with a sociology PhD who focuses on demography as a subfield of sociology, typically.
Commissioner
But
Bravo?
it's a very general term, I think.
I think we're safer staying with the general term, because if you get into the discussion of, you're going to get into what kind of demographer and what kind of statistician, and it's going to go on forever.
Yeah, we're just trying to set aside a fund. Yeah, for experts that are not our other experts that we are specific about.
Well, I learned something.
Okay, let's move on.
Okay, so now we get into the contract section, and so much of the work, because of the way we've staffed this commission, so much of our work is through contracts. The first few are fairly self-explanatory. They're all with the state. Again, you've got your accounting services through DGS, our human resources services through DGS, and our CalSTARS. CalSTARS, for all of you, is how you get paid, or how we get paid. So this was a particularly important line item for staff. And so probably the first one that really bears some scrutiny is the third line, or fourth line, translation. And this assumes, again, the estimate of a translation services from CCC because of, and we're assuming, by the way, in our budget, that the note there, we're assuming the translation services because for CCP, it would have been a subcontract, and it would have exceeded 25% and been over $50,000. So they couldn't carry it under their budget. This assumes 2 translators at all events. Will we have 2 translators at all events? No. Well, I'm going back to Commissioner Yao's comment that we have to look forward to what we're going to do and be realistic about it. At the same time, going to Commissioner Ward's comment, we have to act as though we might use those services at every event. And in fact, there may be some events where we need 3 or 4. I think that this is a high number, but I don't know any other way to make sure that we have the funds to pay for it. So that's why it's at the level it's at. Any questions on translation services? Okay, the next item is our line drawer consultant. This was, I feel very good about this number because both Commissioner Yao and I came out with it together. So I think that's a good sign for the commission, and in fact, I think that will be what it is. Legal services exclusive of litigation. Was it really? Did we end up?
This is the number that we came up with in concert with the Legal Advisory Committee.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think it was specified as voting rights. I think it just got dropped in terms of the language on the line item, but that's the voting rights.
And Mr. Claypool, a question regarding why these line items, the line drawer consultant, we have some big ticket items that are all in the second fiscal year?
Well, all of these will be payment upon completion.
Thank you.
The third one is our inline process review. Again, it's a payment upon completion item. Go ahead.
It just struck me that one of the things we discussed yesterday about the voting rights attorney, law firm, entity attorney, is that we wanted to keep out the possibility of it being an in-house staff attorney, in which case it wouldn't be upon completion. It would be a staff salary.
So it may be useful just for budgeting purposes to split it so we have that option. I'm assuming we can we can roll over from one fiscal year to another if it ends up being a payment upon completion. Is that a safe assumption? Or is that not a safe assumption?
And again, for our purposes, I think that we can put it into this fiscal year, and for someone and I think it would be safe to say that, remember, we're only talking about paying for somebody for about 4 months. So we could roll 50,000 of this in and keep 250 on the other side, and that would be the amount that we would hold back for someone that we salaried if we did.
Commissioner Forbes.
Yes, my question is along the same lines, is that, and I don't know what the practice is, but would a professional firm be willing to be paid at the end? And that's not the way I would imagine it would be done.
Commissioner DeGiulio.
Along those same lines, if we're trying to kind of cover ourselves, if for some reason we have to go to an interagency agreement for a technical consultant, would that be a payment in this fiscal year? Or I'm saying that I see CCP has payment for both this fiscal year and the next because they're an interagency agreement. If we end up doing an interagency agreement with a technical consultant, should we put some into this fiscal year as well too, instead of upon completion, in anticipation that they may be an interagency agreement as opposed to a contract?
And we're on the line item above contractual or staff services. Is that the?
Let me back. I guess I'm looking at the way we have the setup in the next page for CCP is that they're actually because they're an interagency agreement. Is that correct?
Right.
They're being paid here, and I'm just concerned that if we, as we discussed yesterday, some of our options, if we have to drop out of the bid process or if we go to the interagency agreement with the tech consultant, would that payment be different than it would not be at the completion of services? It would be during this fiscal year, similar to the way it's been set up with CCP?
I'm not certain that it's going to make a difference. I would have to talk with somebody that has more experience with me than budgets. This is setting it up just to let them know where we think we're going to spend these dollars so that they can see how it's going to affect the money we have available. I would have to, actually, I can't tell you the answer to that. I just have to ask and come back to you. But my initial reaction is probably doesn't make a difference.
Whether it's in this fiscal year or the next fiscal year.
That we would have the funds available to us for the activities, and that they wouldn't necessarily be released in that manner. But I will ask, but that's a good question.
Okay. Commissioner Blanco.
And then I'll cede some of my time to Mr. Miller. I'm concerned that there's a little bit of a mismatch between what we said we would include in our our solicitation. Thank you. Where we were saying that people should present us with their proposal for what the fee arrangement could be, and that's going to be part of the package we review when we review the possible candidates or entities for the voting rights work. And the best person might say, I'm going to work on this kind of basis, and it may mean payments in, in 10-11, and not just at the end of a completion of work. So And I suspect that a lot of that people, we will get more people wanting to be paid along the way than people willing to be paid only upon completion of the work. So I think we need to rethink this for the legal part of this.
And certainly need to find out where these pools of money can reside as far as tapping them. The one thing I will say is that this process isn't going to be very long. So most people aren't going to be waiting long to be paid, other than how long it's going to take DGS to pay them out. But it does require some thought as to whether or not we need to have pools of money on both sides and where they should reside.
I mean, I would divide it in a way that you would divide how many months, and put the equal amounts in each of the months of each fiscal year.
Mr. Miller, were you in the queue?
Pardon me?
Were you in the queue?
I was, but Commissioner Blanco and Fords have expressed my thought. It is the custom, certainly in the legal industry, to invoice on a monthly basis, and particularly in the sense that we may find a solo practitioner devoting full time to this, it would be difficult for that person to practice without being able to invoice along the way. So I would encourage flexibility on this issue.
Thank you. Noted.
One additional comment is you can invoice it, but just think how long it takes for the state to pay. So we're talking about March, April, May this year, or this fiscal year. By the time you build the state, you're not going to likely to get paid out of this year's budget. So that's again is what we have experienced anyway. So.
Mr. Claypool, use your judgment and put some into this year.
I'll check first, and then we'll make the adjustments. Inline process review, I think, was where we were at, and this is the discussion, inline process review, and this is a discussion we've been having. And so I'm wondering whether I had put it at 15%. We had heard early on from Mr. Johnson from the Rose Institute saying that this isn't really a $5,000. This isn't a procurement item for $5,000 or less. That most of the individuals who would produce the types of work that you're going to require them to do are going to be equally qualified as our line drawer, and probably set up some parallel system to look at the data themselves that you direct them to look at. So that's. I've got that number there.
It's a reasonable
Sounds
estimate.
reasonable to me.
Mr. Claypool, we're going to have to wrap up soon, so I think we're
Should I
close to the end. Why don't you just run through the rest?
Actually, the remaining contracts there are all contracts that are just in place for you. I mean, we've either paid them already or we're working with them. Probably the best thing to do is go over to page 3 in the interagency agreement. We have pre-litigation support for our chief counsel. We discussed that yesterday, just our estimated per our chief counsel. Below that is are the amounts for CCP. We have identified a line drawing expertise for our outreach meetings, and that is been taken care of. I'm going to need this commission to consider that it will be a very highly qualified individual in the Rose Institute. Has agreed to provide the services that our commission, in their deliberation with CCP, discussed as far as the approach to going to a broad appeal to the people that are out there for learning about how they can participate in the process, as opposed to the other approach that we had been discussing, or actually had been presented to us, about being more of a directed towards trainers to train them to go out and then to train others. This was our best solution for getting that training going and getting it completed. And then the final thing in this menu is the external outreach, and I would like Janice to hand out a handout. Is that the correct one?
Could I ask a question?
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Sorry. I'm just curious from the outreach committee if I don't think we've really, as a full commission, have had a chance yet to go over the numbers from CCP. And does the outreach committee feel comfortable? That's an $800,000 contract, and that's a lot of money considering we haven't really vetted that budget yet. Has the outreach committee done that, or staff, or do we feel okay? Because that's a significant amount of money. I don't feel like I know what that's necessarily for. I have confidence in CCP, but I'm just curious as to the detail.
In anticipation of the agenda that we'll be moving towards later today, we will be spending a significant chunk of time picking up where we left off with outreach, so we will have opportunity to review that budget in more detail, and we can always direct Mr. Claypool to make any adjustments as necessary.
Thank you.
Chairman Loy.
Commissioner Yao.
When we talk about the budget for the outreach in the later session, that's only the roughly $160K for the educational workshop. We will not have any opportunity to talk about the cost for the input session, as far as my understanding is. So I think that will remain a estimate until such time we get around talking to it.
The one thing I would like to say about the issue with an interagency agreement, and I know that there's a lot of concern about how large that contract is and what they're providing. It is an agreement between one state agency handing money to another state agency. It's an agreement from general fund money traveling to a university, which doesn't mean that we should overpay for things or anything else. But it is the reason why interagency agreements are achieved so much more quickly, is because the state has less of a problem knowing that the state will still retain the expenditure for those funds in some way. So if I just would hope that would give you some comfort that it's that the state looks at these types of agreements differently, and so. Do you want to just pick up on the external outreach? Okay, yesterday I've grouped this amount all in one item. I had asked, if Janice will hand this out, and I had asked for, everyone had asked about what this money would fund if we went to the regional outreach centers. And so this is the detailed analysis of what is being asked for. There are also some options if we wish to expand the different types of outreach centers. But this is one of the things that was envisioned for the by Q2 originally when I had the discussion with Cara McDonald, and then the other part of this budget was the expense for looking at the online mapping services such as Maptitude, District Builder, ESRI Provider, or Google Maps. Now Commissioner Anchetta had asked us to look into the cost of site licenses for the Maptitude, and we are still looking at that. Quite honestly, the first numbers that we got back from Maptitude were so high as I said, I almost said that must be unbelievable that they would charge that much, but I don't know. So we're still looking at that, but the whole concept of this line item, it was the one that we discussed yesterday about whether or not we wish to provide this type of outreach and have the legislature, which truly is their responsibility in this arena, reimburse us for, or whether we would recommend that they carry it under a line item themselves. That's the idea behind it in this budget. Without going over that just yet, I just would like to quickly go down before we have that discussion and show that there are going to be some changes, and some of these dollars are going to shift back and forth as to where it's at, and we're going to have an increased expenditure. But I would imagine that we're going to end up with a total projected expenses of approximately $6,300,000, and that. This will allow us to go forward certainly to the Department of Finance, this budget, once we've made the corrections to it, and ask for an unencumbrance of the $1 million that's in the 10 and 11 budget. And I believe that's not going to be a substantial issue. I believe that they will release that money to us, because I believe this is a credible picture of what we intend to spend, or what we believe we should spend to do what was intended by the Act. And then the remainder of this document will then turn around and be the basis for our second letter to the Department of Finance requesting a budget augmentation.
Are there any additional questions on the budget? I have a process suggestion, which is that given that there were a number of changes to the budget, that based on our conversation that you can go back and make those changes, and we can come back and as one of our later items of business in the day revisit and hopefully approve the budget. We do need to take action on the 4 retired annuitants, as I understand.
Yes.
Comment from Commissioner Aguirre.
Yes, we talked previously about perhaps having also an evaluator, informing us on the quality of our process, and also making sure that we have the documentation on what we're doing. I think that not only will it inform the quality of the process, but it will also, having an evaluator will also inform the final reporting, because it'll assist with compiling all the documentation. So I think it'll help us meet our objective of having a final report that passes muster. So,
Commissioner Aguirre, would you have a sense of an estimated cost on that line item? I think we'd want to try and estimate whether that can be packaged into our consulting line item, or whether it's significant enough that we would need to build in additional resources.
yes, I think that this would require like a PhD level individual, and in conversation with Mr. Ancheta, we think that 100,000 would do it. So.
Do any other commissioners have feedback on this potential addition of the $100,000? Commissioner Yao.
Is this in addition to, above and beyond the line item called in-process review, which is 15% of the line drawing contract as an estimate, or is this something totally different?
Yeah, it would. I think that it would be different in that the inline process review revolves around the technical aspect.
Thank you.
So in the interest of time, and knowing that we will have opportunity to revisit and the finalized budget later this afternoon, are there any additional questions or directions for Mr. Claypool in terms of changes? Are you pointing at?
You might make, before we put this issue to bed, could we add $100,000 to this item called technical analysis or contractual or staff services costs, which when we talk about the demographer and so on and so forth?
Sure, that would be certainly appropriate if we detail it out on the comment section, so
right.
we don't lose that.
Just add another $100,000 for that to
in the next fiscal year.
Okay.
Okay.
Noted. Commissioner Blanco.
So if we leave this item now, or are we going to come back and discuss the additional outreach line item budget that's in here?
So my understanding, and I'm open to correction, is that when we have our outreach, when we continue where we left off with the outreach report back, we will be talking about the budget for, again, this first phase of work. But given that we don't have anything from potential contractors for those second and third phases, that really what we're trying to build in is a straw man number so that we have the flexibility in the budget to accommodate that later.
But I think just a clarification.
No, I'm
I think
referring
that's
to
the technical. I don't think that's really the software aspect hasn't been considered by the outreach. That was a technical. So if we want to table that for later discussion, I don't think that will be wrapped up necessarily with outreach. We could talk about it, but previously it's been in the technical advisory committee.
So I just want to remind everyone that there is a deadline for us to get this augmentation letter in that we're well past already. So we just need to have something that is reasonable, that gives us flexibility to make these decisions, that we estimate high enough to cover what our expenses might be. If we spend less, I'm sure everyone's going to be happy. But it needs to be reasonable and defensible so we can get that letter to the Department of Finance. So I don't want to start micromanaging this to such a degree that, I mean, we're not going to get a perfect budget. It's just an estimate.
Right. It's just I had a question about this document, and I didn't know if we were going to come back to it, or this was
Commissioner?
it.
Commissioner, I'm sorry, Mr. Claypool.
I think that it might be helpful. The item that you're talking about, Commissioner Blanco, will not be broached by the Outreach Committee. However, it might be helpful if I readjusted these numbers. We heard from the Outreach Committee, and then on our second visit, when you see all the numbers together, then we could discuss that one, and it might be a better venue for it.
Okay.
Any additional direction for Mr. Claypool as he goes back to make changes to this draft budget? Thank you very much for your feedback. And then the second point, we do need to take action on the 4 retired annuitants, so I am open to entertaining a motion in that regard.
I'd like to move that we approve the hiring of the 4 retired annuitants. That includes 3 that will be full-time for 2 months, and 1 that will be the legal, that will be half-time for approximately 6 months.
Second.
From Commissioner Baraba is the second. And when you are able, if you could repeat back the motion.
That the Commission approve the hiring of the 4 retired annuitants. 3 full-time for 2 months and 1 half-time for 6 months.
Excellent, as specified in our draft budget. Floor is open for discussion. Seeing no discussion on the part of the commissioners, I'd like to open this item up to the public for comment. Seeing none, I'd like to call the vote. Let's do a show of hands. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed? Seeing none, motion passes. At this time, I would like to call a recess. We are going to recess. I'm going to call a 15-minute recess because of the fact we have some technical setup issues we need to deal with. So it is now about 10:40. Let me consult with my tech. Would 10 minutes be enough, or do you need 15? Okay. So let's reconvene here then at 10:50. We are on recess.